Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with you and discuss this. Probably I've been asked to be a moderator because I can claim some neutrality or distance to the subject, as I come from a country which is not a member state of the European Union, Iceland. But let us not have more ado about it, and I would like to ask the panel to share their thoughts, and I will start the farthest to the left from my side.
Hello to everybody. Thanks for having us. It's a great honor and intellectually invigorating to be here with you. Defining freedom is the subject of the conference, and I propose to define it as the freedom to pursue and defend one's own interests. Obviously, that has its limits. Freedom needs fairness. Fairness needs rules. Rules limit freedom. Now, speaking as a Hungarian, someone from a Central European country, we have lived for a long time under foreign domination, and we tend to understand this freedom not just as individual, but also as the freedom of a society, of a nation, as it were, to decide its own fate, its own destiny. Now, obviously, I mentioned the freedoms that come with freedom, the limits that comes with freedom all the time. In the context of the European Union, all member states have delegated some of that freedom to decide some of their sovereignty to EU institutions. And whenever we discuss the future of Europe in the context of freedom, we usually talk about that question. Should member states delegate even more of their freedom, even more of the sovereignty to EU institutions? Or, well, should the EU get more powers to discipline member states, or should it hand back some of these powers to the states? And I would propose that if we give too much power to the EU central institutions, that may, in the long run, turn out to be self-destructive. The way I think to best look at it is in the areas of migration policy and foreign policy. Let me begin with an anecdote. Not long ago, we organized, we as Mathias, Corvinus, Collegium in Budapest, we organized a conference on German-Hungarian relations, and at one point, one of the German representatives, delegates, touched upon foreign policy. He said, we must speak with one voice in Europe. The EU must speak with one voice in foreign policy, and for that it is necessary to have decisions by qualified majority, not by consensus, and that is especially necessary to confront China. And he delicately hinted that there was a problem with this because my own country tended to have, think with its own mind and not to shut up about it. So there was a problem, he said. Well, I asked, if there are different points of view, may it not be that the national interest of your country is different from the national interest of my country? And if that is so, why should we then speak with one voice? Should we not simply shut up and speak when we do have one common point of view? And his answer was, well, you better. Because if not, France and Germany will simply agree on something and Hungary will be left lying by the side of the road. Well, that did not sound like a voice of freedom to me. It sounded like forcing other people to do what they don't want to do. And it was a déjà vu moment for me. But I think it was in November 2015, I attended a meeting between delegations of the German governing party CDU and the Hungarian governing party, and one subject was migrant quotas. You may remember that back then there was an attempt led from behind the curtains by Germany to introduce migrant quotas. It was a pilot project, limited in time, limited in numbers, but at that meeting it was made quite clear that this was just a test, and permanent migrant quotas would then follow. And the way this was decided was by qualified majority. It was somewhat of a trick, because normally on such a grave matter the heads of government would have had to decide, but it was delegated to the foreign ministers. They decided with a qualified majority, and we now know that this was a tragically wrong decision. It drove a wedge between Western and Eastern Europe, or the EU, it fragilized the political systems of many Western states. Anti-migrant parties flourished, mainstream parties, traditional parties collapsed. So it was a very bad decision. And I will not forget the reply of the then Minister of the Interior of Germany, Thomas de Maizière, when he was asked, is this not a somewhat delicate matter? Should we not approach it with some caution? And he said, Mehrheit ist Mehrheit, majority is majority. So it was a wrong decision. And now the very same people who would have forced these migrant quotas upon us with qualified majority want to base EU foreign policy on the very same concept that proved so disastrous at the time. Foreign policy, France and Germany want to base it on qualified majority, and I am sure that these ideas do not come from Portugal. I'm not quite sure, but I'm guessing here. I don't think Malta or Bulgaria want to be global players. I think that it's the historical big powers, France and Germany, who are pushing these ideas. Why? I don't know. Maybe because there's some collective memory that they were great states some time ago, and maybe this leads to delusions of grandeur. They can see they're becoming smaller and weaker economically and demographically, but if they can use the EU as an amplifier, then maybe they can still have weight on the international scene. And in order to do that, well, how are you going to persuade the smaller states? You give them a lot more money, and you add rules to that money that makes it more difficult for them to pursue their own national interest. I think that's what's happening right now. So, I mean, there's a logic to this, but it's not a logic of freedom, it's a logic of power. And I do think that if you apply too much force to a structure, it can break. If we try to unify the EU too much, it can prove to be self-destructive. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning to everybody. Let me welcome you. I think I'm the only Portuguese here, or at least as a speaker. So let me give you the welcome. And well, Portugal, as you know, we are an independent nation state for practically 900 years. So. And with the same borders in Europe since the end of the 13th century. So, and we fight very hardly to that. So people of my generation are sometimes very negatively impressed by by what I say, the kind of enlightenment that people has in this country. I mean, most part of the political establishment with Europe, with the Europe Federation, with the Brussels orders, that sort of things. But going back to the concept of freedom, I think there are two ideas about freedom that for me are very important. One is very conservative, but I hope nobody will be scandalized by that. Is Augustine's saying that freedom is the possibility of practicing the good. And the threat today is that maybe we cannot practice the good. We can practice wokeism, we can practice political correctness, but maybe the good will be very difficult to practice, because what we are seeing, and other panel people refer to that, what we are seeing in key elements of our societies, like academia, like press or media, and even like the business, like big business, you see that there is a kind of coercion that puts us in difficulty to practice this good. On the other side, I think, and quoting Roger Scruton, that Europe, at the end of the day, is a civilization of nation states. And I think it's good that it will be like that. I saw, even in the critical areas of the European Union, for a long time there was the so-called Eurosceptics, Nowadays, I think the most part of Eurosceptics reconverted in something that is different and is better in my sense. Is a Europe of nations, but a Europe of national states independent, that has, what I say, an inheritance coming from Christian values, coming from the resistance of external threats, and also coming, and I think this is also extremely important, coming, and my predecessor speaker spoke about that, coming from resistance to attempts of imperial dominion from the big countries in Europe. We have of course, in 16th century, in one sense, Charles V tried that. And 19th century, Napoleon tried that. And in the 20th century, Hitler tried that again. And always, by our own means or by outside support, we resist all these attempts of domination, of imperium over us. Now maybe is the smart way to do it, not, because sometimes people say about German attempts to hegemony, they say, no, they are repeating it. No, of course, it's ludicrous. It's totally different to try dominate you, putting the tanks or making the blitzkrieg and the Stukas and giving you money. But sometimes at the end, the result could be the same. So in that sense, I think it's extremely good that people like you, all of us here, are thinking on these questions because, and let me finish with the second point and going to the last resolutions of the European Parliament. I think the majority of the European Parliament is, in some sense, making a trade-off with the illiberal, radical left in all the things that concern family values, wokeism, because I saw that in this country. Our socialist government, I will not describe them as radicals, but to have the support of the left-wing radicals of Bloc ou de Esquerda, they left bloc, as they call themselves, that are reconverted Trotskyists. Reconverted Trotskyists is very amazing that you never ask these people, I never tell them that their ideas have already been experimented by 70 years in Soviet Union, by a lot of time in Maoist China and in Cambodia and all these places, but never people ask them about that. So my point is extremely dangerous at this moment because what I see is a kind of political correctness of the so-called center. They practically don't see the illiberal left. I was very happy the other day because The Economist for once has a front page about illiberal left because they normally spoke a lot about illiberal right, but they, till 2 weeks ago, they haven't seen the illiberal left. So in that sense, I think we have to resist this kind of coalition that is, on one side, politically correctness, on the other side, a kind of center of, I don't know what, but that wants to accept all the illiberal left cultural message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I find it, first of all, thank you for this convention and thank you very much for inviting me because the voice of the Conservatives is very rarely heard and we need to find support in one another and therefore, thank you very much for doing this. It's useful. It's the first of its kind. I hope there will be many more afterwards. Now, my problem is, of course, that Boris and Louis have already said part of the things that I wanted to say because I think we are in agreement here. And my idea of sort of looking at the notion of freedom for the future of Europe is that we tend to work from the sort of blurry definition of Europe. Is Europe the continent? Is Europe the cultural tradition? Is Europe the EU? And you have this sort of mission creep for the EU that means that slowly the body itself that has created itself in Brussels has become something that brings together outside any kind of practical experience. The people who sent there have had practical experience in their own countries, but that gets lost in the vortex that happens in Brussels itself, and that is when illiberal and decisions are taken, fostered, continued, and that there becomes a kind of holy writ from Brussels, which, as you quite rightly say, comes from the liberal left. And many of these people, I know the French contingent, many of these people were Trotskyites at university, and they have learned things that they haven't forgotten. I should at this stage admit that I briefly was a Trotskyite at university, so you can be cured from that. And it teaches you not to like a few things that made you stop being it. But still, the general mindset of all the generations alive right now that are in Brussels is mostly left-wing, with the right being an oddity, retrograde, to be criticized with different attitudes. For instance, the most sort of fascinating fact is even today, when we know exactly what happened in Stalinist Russia and in China, that we still say quite rightly that Hitler was beyond the pale, but we do not express the same aversion towards communist Russia and communist China, and that shows you that there is a different way of looking at things that has informed the mind of these people. In terms of Europe, the EU, and I would like to remind everyone that when Jacques Delors was the president of the Commission almost 30 years ago, he said that Europe should remain lean, it should be a small bureaucracy outfit, and it should be an ad hoc organization. People, especially in Britain, the country where I work, joked about Jacques Delors, but Jacques Delors is possibly the person who's been the most betrayed by the evolution of the European institutions in Brussels, because they now are bloated, they now are full of functionaries, the functionaries live to generate regulation. I am not against the notion of regulation. I think we do not live in a jungle, and it is useful to have regulation, but now we have this almost inevitable progress in which regulation is being produced for, first of all, for regulation's sake, and also to foster an agenda that is not even discussed, because it is supposed to be the agenda of the good of the Union, and it ends up doing exactly what Boris and Louis were describing, which is that people are being bullied to accept as being good the decisions that are contrary to the interest of the citizens they represent. And there's an element of cynicism in the European institutions, and my example on this one is something that happened very recently, and I find it too amusing not to share it with you. As you know, Britain decided to leave the European Union, and leaving the European Union was seen in Brussels and in large countries of the European Union, like mine, France, for instance, and Germany, as absurd, unacceptable, and morally wrong. And there's a huge difference between an independent nation, which has had parliamentary democracy for almost a millennium in various shapes, to be told that they are wrong, that they are morally wrong, that you think it's a wrong decision for them. I happen to think it did not help them. The French are much slyer. The French, we sign up for everything, and if we don't like it, we don't do it. But that's the French way. What's interesting, the man, as you probably know, the negotiator of Brexit on behalf of the European Commission was a Frenchman, Michel Barnier. Michel Barnier's mission was to make it so painful for Britain that no other nation of Europe, of the European Union, would want to get out. And I'm not saying that the British prepared well for the negotiation at Brexit, because there are many instances where one part of the government delegation that was in the office of Michel Barnier was squabbling with the other part in the office of the negotiator, which gave a very sort of interesting idea of how cohesive the British government was on the conditions of Brexit. And we see with the Northern Ireland Agreement that there were difficult decisions that were sort of solved by non-solutions, which have consequences. But all the same, there was a cohesive attitude of Europe to push the British, even though they were getting out of the EU completely and were ready to have something that's almost no deal, to accept essentially inroads in their sovereignty. And they go from accepting the European Court of Justice declarations, the decisions and rulings. It goes to a number of conditions to practice democracy, that the EU said you cannot even have a simple trade treaty if you do not abide by this or by that. Well, Monsieur Barnier is now a candidate for the presidency of the Republic. We're having in France an election in April of next year. What does he say? He suddenly starts denouncing the assault on French sovereignty by the ECJ, the thing that sort of exercised him, and suddenly say the exact opposite of what he'd been doing as a negotiator for 4 years was a recent ECJ ruling that confirms a requirement that armed forces of EU countries should treat their soldiers as employees and use employment law on terms of holiday, rest, care, etc. The French, who take the army seriously, immediately said, this is complete nonsense. So the EU said, well, you know, the troops that go to the front, of course, are exempt from that. They won't stop fighting at 5:30 in the afternoon or something. But the support will, you know, whether it's the medical support, except on the field, the logistics, the people who maintain the planes, etc., these must abide by employment rules as seen by the European Union Directive of 2003. And the idea that an army actually, you know, has a fighting units, and the fighting units do not need the support and the training, and those units need to be trained and work sometimes day and night for weeks, and the training has to involve this, because otherwise you go fighting and you just are not up to it. This was completely it still is negated by the decision. The decision was ruled because there was a complaint from a soldier in Slovenia, I think, and it was brought to the ECJ, and there was this reaffirmation that the armies were actually coming under, the military were coming under that directive. Michel Barnier then started campaigning, saying that this was outrageous, that it was an offense on the sovereign France, and that he would defend the French military to have the right of, you know, fighting effectively. What's fascinating about this is a complete cynicism of this candidate who wants to sound Gaullist. We had once a Gaullist party, we now have a party that is inherited from that and is really far from Gaullism. But that also shows you that there are several solutions in the way you do things. You can fight it honestly, the way Hungary has done about migrations. You can say that you're okay with it and say, I'm not doing this. You can use it as an argument. And where does that leave people who live in European Union countries? This is, I think, where there's an infringement of freedom. This is where the EU is shown as being a place of compromission and essentially disregard for the sovereignty of states, but also the opinions of its own citizens. I'm not going to go much further on migration, but believe me that the French didn't like the demands of Germany in 2015 any more than Hungary did. We have a slightly different history. And I will conclude, just to sort of throw the ball rolling, because I think now we can go on something else, that I happened just before COVID to be in Japan doing interviews, and I went to see somebody in official circles, and he said, you realize that we have an age pyramid that is actually quite similar to Germany. We've got too many old people, we don't have enough young people, we have to consider the conditions of immigration. And he said, we estimate that here in Japan we're about 40 years behind Europe in terms of the stage at which migrations have started, mass migration has started into Europe, and therefore we're watching this very carefully. And he paused because he had an instinct for showbiz, and he said, and we plan, having observed exactly what you do, to do the exact opposite. I will leave you with that, and I will pass on this to my neighbor.
Yeah, thank you, Anne-Elisabeth. Thank you, Hannes. First of all, let me thank the New Direction Foundation for this warm invitation. It's the first time for me to join your gatherings. And it's also a pleasure to represent Kypseli, which is a new conservative think tank that we have just established in Rome. And we hope to cooperate and work with all of you in the coming months. So turning to the question that we were given, defining freedom and the future of Europe. Clearly, when we talk about freedom of European citizens, countries, and Europe, we have to grapple with one basic question that Europe and what today is the European Union, as you said, Anne-Elisabeth, is not a textbook definition. You know, it's an historical hybrid, and therefore, you know, we have to go back to the basics and look at European democratic societies, European sovereign member states, and what we have seen, and this is really what I want to expand on in my remarks, is that you know, in the latest decades, European member states have indeed been able to engineer a number of agreements through which they have raised living standards. They've been able to carry out a number of successful initiatives, very much unlike, you know, a number of other proposals and initiatives and projects that have been mentioned in this panel. So I want to go back to the basics and try to sort of understand what worked out, and in order to try to replicate what worked out for you know, a number of projects that as Europeans and as European democracies, democratic member states, we might be focusing on in our near future. So if we look, for instance, at the single market, Dr. Kohn this morning in her keynote address was talking about competition. Well, the single market is, I think, one of the most successful example of cooperation among member states. You know, they ceded some sovereignty, but this sovereignty was more than compensated for. Why? Because the rules of the games were symmetric, benefits accrued broadly, and therefore they really fed into an extraordinary growth of living standards in Europe. And it's interesting how, you know, this successful initiative, this successful project somehow has not been, we have not learned the lesson, or, you know, those in Brussels and in the European capitals that work on European integration, I think they have not learned the lesson because, you know, member states can indeed cooperate. They can enter agreements at the regional and international level. For one thing, you know, the Bretton Woods order was established by member states at the end of the Second World War and set up the current order that we have today. So there are indeed some democratic nations and sovereign nations can indeed work together, but I think we have to be clear, we have to be aware or under what condition this cooperation may really produce some long-lasting, sustainable outcomes. And my fear, as a number of us have already spoken today on this, is that the current initiatives do not quite fulfill, you know, those successful criteria. So, for instance, you know, I was talking about the single market and presenting it as a sort of success story in Europe among member states. You know, if something we should be focusing on is not just you know, initiatives among and within European member states, but also the posture, our posture vis-a-vis the rest of the world. For instance, there are, you know, talks about a trade agreement with China. Of course, you know, no one of us is against trade. We all believe that, you know, more economic opportunities are conducive to greater prosperity and living standards. But the question I want to pose and leave you sort of, you know, with a question mark is really, in Europe we have democracies, democratic member states. To what extent these economies embedded in democratic societies can really compete with the countries that are not democracies? What I'm trying to say is that, you know, in Europe we have certain environmental standards, worker protections, law, intellectual property laws, and so on. So how can Western businesses compete on a level playing field with those countries that actually have different standards, different policies in that regard? And I think, you know, in the future, in order for sort of generate prosperity and sustain our living standards, as Europeans, we have also to ask ourselves, you know, on what basis we need to cooperate with third countries, because competition is important, but it also needs to be nurtured by a level playing field that many times, you know, has not really materialized. And this is what I want to leave you with. So thank you very much.
Well, it's now 22 minutes past 12, and we're supposed to stop at 12:15, so we are 7 minutes over the limit. But I think actually it would be a good idea to take questions from the floor if there is somebody who wants to ask the panel something, and I believe that there would be microphones available. So is there a question from someone? Yes, please stand up and...
I think I don't need to have a microphone. I've got one of those booming voices.
Well, she is actually bringing you one because there might be people there.
Quiet, otherwise blow your ears.
And introduce yourself and tell us to which panelist you are going to address your question. Just use it, yes.
Yeah, there we go. So first, my name is Mitchell Belfer from the Eurogulf Information Center. Actually, my question is to the entire panel. First, it's just to maybe as a segue in. If a dog bites a man, it's not a story. But when a man bites a dog, that is a story because of the shock. And I want to use that as a way to go in a little bit into what European Union policies have looked like over the past 10, 15 years. A lot of them are there for shock value. And they're pushing, but nobody's pushing back. And so in the last panel, we discussed a little bit about what the silent majority is. My question to the panel is, how do you get the silent majority to wake and not become woke? That's my question.
Would you like to answer this, please, on behalf of the panel?
I think that you're quite right in saying that there's an element of shock, and you have to find shock. The vote for Brexit was definitely a shock. It was a nuclear option in so many ways, and it's sort of, I think Britain will rebuild itself, but it's going to take some time. So it's something that you really have to be sort of desperate for. I'm pretty sure that if Britain voted against on Brexit, people would vote for it. There are several attitudes about this. One is there are precedents. The European Constitution was voted against by France, Denmark, was about to sort of have a negative on something else, and they just reshaped it slightly, and then they said, well, you didn't vote the right way the last time, so vote again until you vote well. Well, there are countries where you can do this. I can't name them because I can't think of them, but most people don't like that. So if you tell the silent majority, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? After a bit, the silent majority will say, no, I'm digging my feet in, and I'm not doing it. It's failing that, which is the nuclear option, the idea of creating specific ad hoc parties, the way parties existed in Britain from Jimmy Goldsmith's referendum party to UKIP, and to some extent the Brexit party. And having our issue is we want more freedom for Europe, is not necessarily leaving the EU, is we did not mandate from Europe this political outreach, which is finally incredibly undemocratic, whatever you say, because it's large nations and large groups in the European Parliament that push something that their governments want. And the idea of creating those parties specifically, we want to reform to the European Treaty, including that clause of ever closer union, which is essentially an open-ended mandate to do anything they please for the sake of an ideology that never has been stated. I think that would be a way of doing it, but I'm sure somebody else on the panel has got different ideas.
Well, thank you very much. Just something very short, because we
very
really
short.
have to
I think
end.
it's a great question, and it's an intellectual question we're talking about. We have to solve the problem on an intellectual level, and who would be called upon to do that is academics and publicists, journalists, and we have just heard on the previous panel how the academic world is becoming deprived of free thought, so they cannot articulate what should be articulated, and to a certain degree that's also true for the media. So the people who tend to articulate the wake-up call, they tend to be politicians actually, and I think that's not enough. We should have more of an intellectual debate.
Yeah. Well, just to say something that I think is very important for what the question you were raising. I think the elites, I mean academic elites, media elites, even business elites, are in some sense contaminated by fear of not being enough politically correct, all that sort of thing. So is the people nowadays our last, if we want to defend and preserve our freedom, is the people. So we have to be very careful, for example, in things like vote at distance, all these things, that at the end of the day, as John O'Sullivan was saying, I think the guys who want to take this project to this illiberal left project, they now are, it's very interesting to see an amount of things saying, oh, be careful with populists, remember Hitler, and so and so. So people can vote bad is now what they are trying to say, and to create limits to the expression of the vote. I think this is very important to be aware of that.
Well, thank you very much, and we have ample opportunity to continue discussing these issues, important issues, over lunch. So this meeting is adjourned, and I hope that you join me in applauding the panelists.